Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution. I'm Lucy Lang, and I want to thank you all for joining today's panel on the LGBTQ community and the criminal legal system. The Institute for Innovation in Prosecution is a think tank dedicated to prosecution and criminal justice reform at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. We promote community-centered standards of safety, fairness, and dignity. On this last day of Pride Month, we could not be more proud to be bringing together leading voices taking on the unique and under-acknowledged concerns of LGBTQ+ communities, which have such critical intersections with racial injustice that our country is grappling with in criminal justice and beyond. So many thanks to these panelists for being with us. Our panel is part of a series of virtual panels that the IIP has been hosting during the pandemic. At the conclusion of this panel, we will post the full video as well as additional resources to our website, which is prosecution.org. Please be on the lookout next week for materials we'll be distributing, created in partnership with the Vera Institute of Justice about racial justice and prosecution. At the IIP, we have adopted the practice of living land acknowledgements before our events. Ours is specific to New York City, but we encourage listeners to learn and acknowledge your local history wherever you may be. The IIP is based in New York City, which is Lenapehoking, the Lenape homeland. We honor all indigenous nations and their land with gratitude and acknowledge the genocide and continuous displacement of indigenous peoples. We also acknowledge the enslaved Africans whose labor built New York City during the colonial era and beyond. We acknowledge the harm inflicted upon the indigenous communities and people of color across the country, in particular, the ongoing and current harms to Black communities, including those caused by law enforcement, which inspire our ongoing work. Thank you to the panelists and our guests for participating in a conversation which will require us to expose ourselves to traumatic history and events. This conversation may evoke strong reactions, and in the event that you feel the need, please step away from your computer and take care of your mental health. I'm so pleased to introduce today's moderator, the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution's Policy Advisor, Johnathan Terry, whose work includes policy research and writing, program management, and developing training programs for prosecutors nationally, including the co-creation of the Inside Criminal Justice Seminar, a college class that we teach for prosecutors and incarcerated students to study criminal justice alongside one another in prison. Thank you all for joining us today as we celebrate the end of Pride Month with a discussion on the LGBTQ+ community and the criminal legal system. Johnathan.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for that lovely introduction. I am excited to be here with a number of fantastic panelists, and I'm excited to get started. So, law enforcement and the LGBT community have long had a fraught relationship in America. The modern gay rights movement is often tied back to the Stonewall Riots in 1969, which were a series of demonstrations that took place in response to a police raid at the Stonewall Inn in Manhattan. A generation of gay Americans still remember the terror of the AIDS epidemic and the hostility of the American government towards entire communities in their time of need. And today, the rates of homelessness and poverty are still much higher within the LGBT community than in America at large, and violence against trans women is considered to be at epidemic levels. Within the criminal justice system, LGBT people still represent about 8% of the incarcerated population, despite constituting a little over 3% of the general population. And a 2015 study also found that 28% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people in prison had suffered solitary confinement, compared to 18% of heterosexual people. Black trans women are still much more likely to be stopped by the police, often leading to violent outcomes. At the same time, the Supreme Court's recent decision to protect LGBT people from workplace discrimination and the Black Trans Lives Matter rally that drew over 15,000 peaceful protesters in Brooklyn just weeks ago represent progress. And acceptance of LGBT people has grown considerably over the last decade. We're excited to be able to hold today's conversation on the relationship between law enforcement and the LGBT community and the roles we all have to play in advocating for justice for all. Unfortunately, Kimberly McKenzie had a last-minute emergency and won't be able to join us, but we are thrilled to welcome our panelists, and we hope that our panel will still enable an intimate conversation And so we invite the audience to send questions throughout the panel. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to send your questions directly to me, or use the raise hand function if you wish to ask your question directly. Joining us today, we have Katie Doran, who was appointed to her position as the advisor to the Manhattan District Attorney for LGBTQ issues by Robert M. Morgenthau in 1988, and was reappointed by Cyrus Vance Jr. in 2009. She was an active member of the Mayor's Police Council for LGBTQ concerns during the Koch, Dinkins, and Giuliani and Bloomberg administrations, and continues to serve on the council during the current administration. In addition to her role as advisor to the DA, Katie is also an advisor to the Hate Crimes Unit, an EEO coordinator, and an active member of the District Attorney's Diversity Committee. Thank you for being here, Katie. Arcelia Hurtado is the Managing Attorney for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. She is the former Executive Director of Equal Rights Advocates, a national women's rights organization, and former Deputy Director of the Immigrant Policy Advisor at the National Center for Lesbian Rights, a national civil rights organization dedicated to achieving LGBT equality through litigation, legislation, policy, and public education. She has also served as a civil prosecutor and assistant general counsel at the Agricultural Labor Relations Board, prosecuting labor law violations on behalf of California farm workers. Thank you for being here, Arcelia. And we are so pleased to be joined today by Vanity Reid-Deterville as well. She is a recent graduate of the College of Charleston, where she obtained a Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science, concentrating in public policy, and is a native of Charleston. As a West Indian transgender woman of color from the South, she stands at the intersections of the LGBTQ and Black communities, and has asserted how she approaches spaces and social issues with a very critical perspective. We thank her for all of her work, including dedicating her time as an activist to LGBTQ initiatives and populations throughout the Low County, experiencing housing and food instability through the outreach of We Are Family, an organization dedicated to LGBTQ youth in Charleston, with the collaboration of the College of Charleston, Joseph P. Riley Center for Livable Communities, and the administration of the Charleston Youth Count. Thank you all for being here today. And I would like to get started with a little bit of background. LGBT people are incarcerated at twice the rates of the general population. And Arcelia, I just wanted to ask if you could give us a bit of background on what leads to such high levels of incarceration and law enforcement contact for members of the LGBT community.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. That's an excellent question. I hope you can hear me. Okay. So we could probably talk about this topic for quite a while, and there's a lot of research and a lot of data out there about the causes of crime in general, right? And we have to center our discussion, I think, in the fact that we can't just look at LGBT people in a vacuum, right? We belong to multiple communities, right? We are part of the African-American community. We are part of the immigrant community. We are part of multiple communities. So when we talk about some of the larger reasons why people are incarcerated, we need to remember that that includes LGBTQIA people. So the reason that LGBT people are overrepresented in the criminal justice system is the reasons are complex, but it starts really with three factors. And I take these from a report that was done in 2016 by the Movement Advancement Project in collaboration with the Center for American Progress. It's an excellent report, and it really outlines for us the reasons why this happens. So three factors lead to increased criminalization of LGBT people, which is discrimination and stigma, of course, from when the time that kids are young and are rejected sometimes by their families because of their identities, their instability, there's poverty, there's negative experiences in the child welfare system. So when you start from the time that kids are young and they are forced into homelessness, sometimes we see this in San Francisco a lot, And fortunately, there's a lot of services for LGBTQIA kids, but the fact of the matter is that they are pushed out of their homes sometimes at an early age. There's unsafe schools. There's the school to prison pipeline. All of that, lack of social services, all of that leads to discrimination and criminalization of kids at a young age. There's also discriminatory enforcement of laws. There's problems with HIV criminalization of consensual sex, and drug laws also disproportionately affect LGBTQIA people because they impact people of color primarily and disproportionately, some of whom are also LGBTQIA. And finally, harmful policing strategies and tactics. So there's problems, of course, with police over-policing our communities, policing of gender norms, aggressive enforcement of anti-prostitution statutes in some jurisdictions, though not in San Francisco. Stop and frisk disproportionately impacts people of color who are, as I said before, sometimes LGBTQIA people. And again, all of this leads to discrimination in the system. Once you enter the system, from judges to prosecutors to defense attorneys, they are also subject to discrimination against LGBTQIA people. And I've seen it in my time in the criminal justice system. So LGBT people are more frequently incarcerated and treated harshly within the system. And then we can talk also about conditions of incarceration, and that's a different topic. But I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you for that background. And we certainly will get to conditions of incarceration soon. Katie, I wanted to think a little bit about low rates of reporting in the LGBT community. We often have incomplete numbers about victimization within the community, in part because people don't want to report being victimized to law enforcement, which is of course understandable given the background that we just heard. But what would you recommend that prosecutors and other members of law enforcement do in order to show their support for the LGBT community and make clear that the safety of the community is a top priority?
Great question. I think the first starting point for me would be the position that I hold, right? Because I think that was created, the LGBTQ, when it was created, liaison to the LGBT community, was to send an important message that there is a person within the prosecutor's office who is here to assist you. It was purposefully created not to be an attorney in the office, so I am not an attorney, because people are sometimes reluctant to engage with police or assistant district attorneys. So it was somebody who could advocate within the office and outreach to the community. So that, I think, is an important step for all prosecutors' office, to have people from all the communities that they represent and that they're from reflected in the DA's office, in the prosecutor's office. Because I think inclusion of community within the system is absolutely critical to making the system more fair and be able to work for everyone. So that's a big thing. It's also important to really kind of continue to grow and learn with the community. You know, one of the examples I always think about is when I first started in the office, there was no hate crime law. There was no bias bill. There was a bias bill and it hadn't passed. And it had been pending for over, I think, 12 years before it passed. And what was interesting is at the time that it was trying to work its way into law, there was a real coalition between people of color, women's groups, religious groups, and gay and lesbian groups advocating for this bill. And at different times, some of the legislators approached different groups and tried to pick off the LGBT community. And to the credit of the coalition, they really held together and said, if it doesn't include all of us, it doesn't protect any of us. So I think that's always a good, great message to carry forward. But by the time it passes, it does not include transgender as a protected category, because when it was written and when the advocacy started, there wasn't a lot of advocacy on behalf of transgender people. So right away, as the law passes, we see that we've left some people behind. The other thing is the law allowed prosecutors, and it still does, to be able to elevate the crime one category, which means it elevates the seriousness and the possibility of penalties. And so when it first is envisioned, that's a great message that they want to send, which is we're going to take these crimes seriously. By the time it passes, we're really rethinking the over-criminalization of young people, of Black and brown people. And so now we're saying, did we really want to put that strong a tool in the hands of the prosecutor? And so we went back as the prosecutor's office to rethink, like, okay, we do have this power. What do we want to do with this power? And that really led us down a very deep and very good conversation about restorative justice. And even though we can probably get more jail time, we can also use it as a tool to encourage people to accept a re-education program and to really begin to learn from their mistakes. And we can incorporate the victim's needs in that as well. So that's the other important message, is we always have to kind of work with and learn from and evolve with the communities that we're serving. Because what begins at point A doesn't end at point B, it goes on to C, D, E. You know, we're ever expanding our notions about what is the most just outcome. And I think DA's offices really have to include both lawyers and community members to kind of make that a possibility.
Thank you for that. And on that topic, I want to think a little bit about trans rights and the protection of trans people in this country. It's not uncommon for corrections departments to justify placing members of the LGBT community in solitary confinement for their own safety. We often see high levels of violence among the trans community in America, so much so that the Human Rights Campaign called violence against trans people in America an epidemic. To change that, it's going to take a massive cultural re-education around LGBT issues and more normalization of trans people within popular culture. But I wanted to ask, what are some immediate policy changes that our panelists would like to see enacted to help protect trans lives? Vanity, I'd like to invite you into the conversation, but also open it up to anyone else who has comments.
Thank you, Johnathan. So when we think about the issues as it refers to the vilifying of trans bodies and those who live a life of trans experience, I think it's especially critical to realize the bureaucratic strongholds and the political blockages that trans people face when it comes to living a fulfilling life, right? Just earlier this year in South Carolina, there was a bill introduced, H 4716, which would effectively prohibit healthcare providers, counselors, anyone that could provide anything that deals with the transition to a gender nonconforming or a transgender individual. It would prevent them from being able to provide that medical attention or counseling before the age of 18. And so when you have political blockages like this, when it comes to a trans or gender nonconforming individual choosing to live their life in a more fulfilling fashion, now you have alternative routes to achieving a transition which may not be regulated by FDA, by physicians. And so a child then goes onto the street or to a grocery store and tries to get their own remedy to combat the gender dysphoria that they may be experiencing. So now you are now politicizing the fact that someone is only working hard to fulfill themselves and to be a better version of themselves, but it will soon become illegal. if we don't change policies and lobby for the strike down of policies like this. That's just one of the many ways in which I see politically how we can rally for the paradigm shift and understanding how to raise trans and GNC bodies and queer youth in general. There really needs to be a giant shift in the parenting styles. We have to continually educate what the differences between sexuality and gender identity are, because most of the time when you think about trans bodies, we're discussed, of course, by those who are ignorant to the facts in terms of sexuality, as opposed to, in most terms, being around gender identity and expression. And so we have to learn that they are exclusive concepts, but that you still have to think about one after having thought about sex already. And so that continual education of discerning the difference between the two, so that parents and counselors and schools may become better equipped to dealing with queer youth, so that they become less likely to end up on the street or be displaced forcefully out of their homes, so that they are less predisposed to the violence that comes with being housing insecure, like substance abuse, sexual coercion, sexual abuse, so that they are less predisposed to all of these things that lead them down the road to incarceration. So when they say it really does begin in the house, it does begin in the household.
Thank you for that. Incredibly powerful thought on how all of this begins and how we start to address these issues at home, not necessarily just at a policy level. I also want to think a little bit about what Arcelia mentioned earlier in terms of confinement and conditions of incarceration. Both members of the LGBT community and trans people who are incarcerated suffer much worse realities when inside a prison. And I wanted to open up to the panelists if there are any recommendations that they have or any thoughts they have on how should we be thinking about LGBT issues when it comes to incarceration. What are things that we should be offering to people who are incarcerated that protect them once they're there and prevent them from becoming even further victimized?
One of the ways in which, if I discuss, because I read recently of a Black transgender woman in North Carolina who was living her life as a woman and was completely on paper and surgically post-operative. That's what was reported. Who was incarcerating on, I believe it was fraud charges, and was placed in male custody, male population, despite the fact that she had gone through the channels of making sure recognized and respected on paper as she aligned her identity. And so when you see instances of someone following the channels sanctioned by the state to be respected as they know themselves, but to still be disrespected, the fact that they have to serve a punishment while also being ostracized and chastised and humiliated is an extra level of punishment that none of us really think about when we think about the carceral state, right? And so really helping educate folks to what PREA entails and the rights that you are entitled to under PREA, and maybe even lobbying for the revision of certain clauses within PREA so that we can make sure that these protections per se are guaranteed and that we don't have to have large constituencies emailing and calling and knocking on the doors of the corrections department so that we can make sure that this law and policy that's already Rape and Elimination Act, which includes trans and gender nonconforming folks within those protected classes, we can beef that up and make sure that not only our trans brothers and gender nonconforming siblings are knowledgeable about what that policy includes, but beef it up so that we can make sure that it entails and it guarantees the protection once someone becomes incarcerated and their life is even more threatened. We're seeing instances where from the Department of Health and Human Services, we have struck away gender identity from the interpretation of sex. And so that means every other policy that deals with protected classes of people will have to be beefed up forthgoing.
I want to add to that question. I want to still leave open to the floor for anyone to continue to think about how we continue to protect or increase protections rather for members of the LGBT community who are incarcerated. But I also wanted to pose a question that was asked by one of our attendees, which thinks about the way that the criminal legal system it necessarily controls Black and brown people in our country. They ask if it's possible for us to do anything really to increase the safety of Black and brown LGBTQ people, considering the roots of our system and where we are now. So how do we think about the position that that law enforcement is in, our ability to use our position as, for some of us, members of law enforcement or people who work with law enforcement to help members of both Black and brown LGBT communities?
Well, I'll chime in. In San Francisco, and this is a broad approach that we have taken, but in San Francisco, my office has been behind a suite of police reform and accountability policies that we've advanced in our at the local level in order to increase the safety of all citizens from police misconduct and police brutality and excessive force. And again, I want to center us within that because we are, the LGBTQ community is a part of the broader community. And I want to emphasize that because when we talk about reform at a system level, we're talking about reform that's going to affect the LGBTQ community and hopefully alleviate some of these problems within our own community, right? So the DA here in San Francisco has taken it very, very seriously that there is this violence that's occurring, right? And so one of the reforms that my office has taken is to really open the channels of communication with the LGBTQIA community. So we've, and Katie alluded to some of this, and really having those channels of communication open so that we are aware of problems when they happen and we can be responsive. And we can hold law enforcement accountable, and we are part of law enforcement as prosecutors. So we've started an LGBTQIA advisory board, which is meeting quarterly with members of the community to, again, keep those channels of communication open and find out what's happening in our community so that we can be more responsive. Of course, the creation of my position, similar to Katie's position, so that we can be more inclusive of everyone within our office as well as in the community, because we are public servants as law enforcement, and we have to really remember that and hold ourselves accountable and to the highest standards. We also recently took, as an office, a racial justice and equity pledge, which is really an oath that we took as an office. It was a very powerful moment where the DA led us in an oath that we will hold ourselves accountable and not tolerate bias or discrimination within our system at any level. And we all took it together as an office. It was a voluntary pledge, but it was a very powerful moment. So I think we start where we have control of, we start with what we have control of, right? So as prosecutors, and Katie said this, we have a lot of power and we have to hold ourselves accountable at the same time that we're holding police accountable.
And I'm just going to chime in and say one of the ways that we've also tried to connect to the communities through some of the community's institutions. You know, I work closely with the New York City Gay and Lesbian Anti-Violence Project. Sometimes people will go to them to report things that happen to them because they don't know if it's safe to go to the police. And they don't know if it's safe to go to the DA's office. And then somebody from the Anti-Violence Project will talk to me. And, you know, eventually, you know, I might talk to the victim and just explain a little more about the whole process, right? Because it's a whole different world. It's a different culture that we're asking victims and survivors to go into at a very vulnerable moment in their life, right? And we're asking them to trust us, and they know the history. They've heard the stories, they've watched Law and Order, whatever it is, whatever they know about the police or the DA's office, they bring with them, whether it's from their own experience or from stories or, you know, wherever we get our information about police and DAs. And so I think it's very important for people in law enforcement to really be kind of forward and to really try and engage with the community, both in those, understanding those vulnerable moments, but also doing education work in general when there isn't a crisis. So one of the things we also do is, you know, at the Manhattan DA's office, we have a lot of curriculum and we go out to the schools. So we teach young people about intimate partner violence. And we are very mindful about our curriculum not being gender specific so that everybody can kind of engage in the story that we tell and kind of use that as the teaching tool. We have a curriculum about hate crime, you know, and we give them ways to think about it and ways to engage in their own worlds around these issues. And I think that's important. And again, I think making sure our office or prosecutors' offices in general send all the right messages. So that includes like training the staff who greets people at the door, because all those little ways send big messages, you know. Making sure, one of the things I do with the prosecutors, we have, you know, young people joining our office, usually every September. One of the things I do is a training, and to ask them to, you know, kind of imagine, kind of walk them through just a visit to the office and ways in which they can signal, whether it's material in their office that just sends a message about that they're aware that these are important issues. So having some literature from the gay community, having some literature from, you know, Black and brown organizations sends a powerful message. Not having the radio blaring, not having other, you know, people in the office, though it's hard because we all share office. It's, you know, it's not a big space, but really talking to your office mates about, listen, I'm going to have somebody in here and I'm going to be asking them incredibly kind of personal questions. Can you be mindful, you know, and just kind of either give us the space alone or, you know, maybe we'll try and find a different space. I think just really thinking about who's coming to us and what do they need from us is a great starting point, you know, and I think we should always be mindful of that.
Thank you. I want to think a little bit about the history. I want to think a little bit about what people bring when they approach law enforcement. Nationally, we're having a conversation about defunding the police and rethinking the way that law enforcement operates. And I want to ask to any of the panelists if they think that the current culture of law enforcement, in addition to more harshly affecting Black communities in particular, if the current culture of law enforcement has contributed to violence being perpetrated against trans people, and about the growth that anyone here has seen potentially within law enforcement over the last however many years.
So I'll start, since I think I'm the dinosaur on the panel. I've been in my position since 1988. And I have seen a lot of change. At the same time, there's never enough change. Right? I think we would be insane. It would be morally wrong to say that we haven't contributed to the violence directed at LGBT people and at particularly, you know, Black trans women, brown trans women, because law enforcement has had a fraught relationship. And they've been the perpetrators of violence at times. When I started, it wasn't unheard of that sometimes an off-duty police officer would be a defendant in an anti-gay case. It wasn't unheard of that when police officers responded to a Black trans woman, they didn't believe her. You know, that they weren't going to take the complaint, that, you know, somehow she was the suspect. She was somehow deceptive in her identity. So yeah, I think, you know, again, morally wrong if we don't see the role we played And at the same time, to really kind of also claim for ourselves that we are evolving and that we're probably not evolving fast enough for folks. I agree. But that we are educating ourselves. I mean, I see the transition because I've been in my position so long. I see how trans issues kind of came to the forefront. I talked about that in terms of, you know, how it came to be talked about in terms of the hate crime law. You know, and initially we all in the 5 city district attorney's offices agreed that we would prosecute anti-trans cases under the gender provisions of the hate crime law until the moment we could get transgender people actually named on the bill as a protected class. And when that movement happened, all the DAs supported that. So I think that's important. I think it's where law enforcement can support the work of the LGBT community. We should do that because a lot of times they bring issues to us, you know, walking while trans, you know, is a bill that, you know, they're talking about in New York City. And I think the district attorneys have supported that it's not right to just criminalize people for embracing and being who they are. And we should not collude in the oppression. So there are always ways we can get better, and we hopefully are getting better, but I do think it always begins with kind of collaborating with, respecting, educating, and putting ourselves forward. Not saying to the community, oh, come and tell us, but having the interest and the commitment to communities to go out and to talk to people and to educate ourselves, because that's really important too.
Can I add something onto that same question, Johnathan?
Of course.
So it's interesting to think about the police force as this modern agency that's contributing to hard times right now. But we've got to think about the evolution of many police agencies from city to city, from sea to shining sea, and their early formation of these agencies, which more times than not in the Southern United States stemmed from the protection against the potential slave rebellion or an uprising of formerly enslaved African peoples in this nation. That lies at the inception of many police agencies here in North America, specifically in the Southern United States. You talk about the Charleston Police Department, and you have to immediately go back to the very early records of when they were slave patrol militia. And so that's the first thing in thinking about the culture that the police foster and how that influences the violence towards trans people, right? The next thing is how much the resources are, how they're being allocated from city to city. In the city of Charleston, we discovered for the 2020 general operating budget that the Charleston Police Department has a budget of over $53 million. However, when you think about the Department of Housing and Community Development, we have less than $1 million. And so there are ways on that scale of where the priority lies in the city's eyes. We have history of the city police here in Charleston forcefully dispersing communities of homeless or housing insecure folk, all for the sake of economic development and expansion. As a port city, tourism has been one of our driving forces. And so the expansion and development has caused many housing insecure and homeless populations to even be displaced. And many trans and gender nonconforming folk are within that population at one point or another in their lives, most of the time because we live in a Bible Belt state and they are forcefully removed from their homes, thus leaving them on the street. And so it's important to think about not only that settler colonialism has contributed to the ways in which Black people police themselves within their own communities, but it has also served as the early formation of police academies and agencies across the nation. And so that root of racist thought is within the early formation of, like I said, police agencies around the world, and their behavior is only evolved from that settler colonialism further inflicting violence onto the Black community and further fostering an environment for violence within the Black community towards more marginalized subsets of people within the Black community. So there are many things that contribute towards the police being able to foster this environment, and it's all very historical.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's an incredibly valuable history to hold on to when we think about how do we go about fixing these issues, which are really entrenched in our history as America. I want to spend the last 15 minutes or so of this panel thinking about solutions, thinking about the future and where we go from here. We have one question in our Q&A about how might substance abuse and mental health treatment courts and the attorneys who appear in them work to better serve LGBTQ defendant participants in those courts? And I want to open that up to anyone.
Sure, I can jump in here. You know, one of the ways that we could really better serve the entire community, and specifically the LGBTQIA community, is to really think about restorative justice, expanding restorative justice programs and diversion programs, including, as the audience member noted, drug and mental health treatment. And I think that in San Francisco, we are working to expand those alternatives to incarceration. Because as we talked about, the LGBTQIA community is overrepresented in the criminal justice system, right? So, and also they are victims of crime disproportionately. So in order to serve and better address the root causes of why these crimes are happening, we really need to think about alternatives to incarceration. Some of the barriers, of course, are that there's a scarcity of programs that are sensitive to the specific needs of the LGBTQIA community. And for instance, issues of homelessness here in San Francisco have really gained national attention, but the reality is that there's a shortage of housing. It's a very expensive housing market. There's a shortage of housing for folks to really transition out of the criminal justice system. There's a shortage of substance abuse treatment programs. All of these things we're really tackling head on here in San Francisco. But those are some of the barriers, is that there are very few programs that we can refer people to that really are designed specifically for our community, the LGBTQIA community.
Thank you for that. Katie, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say that that kind of goes back to Vanity's point, which is how do we spend our resources and how do we kind of lift up and support people having agency around creating programs that are real and that are connected to community and connected to people. And I think in New York, we have had a little bit of success. We need more. We need more. But I know that a number of the institutional LGBT groups like Hetrick Martin Institute, you know, they really are focused on substance use and abuse by young people. And they're really trying to develop strategies to kind of send positive, sober messages to young people, which I think is absolutely necessary. And they're trying to work with organizations about being effective substance abuse counselors and programs that are sensitive to unique kind of concerns of LGBT people and LGBT people of color. And I think that's so critical for law enforcement and for people like the DA's office to really be supportive of those efforts, because those are the things that are really going to change the game. You know, those are the alternatives to incarceration that are going to work, because we're all coming together and it's community based. And I think those are the most effective programs.
Can I add one more small tidbit?
Certainly.
Thank you, Katie, for bringing up, again, the alternatives incarceration. Arcelia, I think you brought that up also. I am actually a practitioner of restorative and healing justice, transformative dialogue. I am a part of a collective that helps offer these services to agencies both private and public. And one of the things, after having experienced my own time going through a pretrial intervention program, I was able to, once recovered from a former abuse issue, identify where I thought the program was effective and where some things were discouraging. The restitution that's paid back to the state by folks who are already dealing with substance abuse issues is a crippling aspect of many alternatives to incarceration and pretrial intervention programs. If we are going to be screening for substances through drug screenings, through hair follicle tests, through counseling classes, I think adding the pressure of someone who is already insecure in a way that's trying to get past that insecurity or that abuse issue, adding the pressure of paying restitution to the state only further worsens the problem. If we can allow folks to take the burden off of themselves with paying restitution back to the state, a state that already has the funding to create these programs in the first place, I think we can really maximize the effectiveness of these alternatives to incarceration and these pretrial intervention programs. As someone who has gone through a program themselves, I see that as one of the major crippling aspects of many to the alternatives, is the money aspect, which you end up paying a fine that it could be up to 2 to 4 times more what the original ticket may have been. And so that's just something to consider when developing alternatives.
Thank you for that. I think that's an incredibly important point when we think about who has access to things like alternatives to incarceration, restorative justice, and diversion. So much of that depends on where physically you are, but I think that it's important for policymakers as they think about wanting to be advocates and actually putting in place policies that are going to advance justice in our communities. They think about how are we holding some people back from being able to fully participate in those programs. Vanity, I wanted to ask you, we've talked a little bit about ways in which prosecutors' offices can embed people in their offices who can force other prosecutors to think about these sorts of issues, but what are some other ways that you want law enforcement to be listening, to be engaging, to be attempting to learn about these issues?
So within the Charleston Police Department, I've seen they were slightly nudged to do it, but I think a large portion of it was intrinsic to the agency. They created an affinity group that was supposed to be liaisons of sorts from the police force to the LGBT community. Many on the force identify within the community, and we actually had a trans masculine sergeant within that group also. And so really taking the effort to create these affinity groups, if we can really implement them effectively so that they may go out into the community when we're having a rally or a protest behind a fallen brother or sister at the hands of violence, to really familiarize themselves with the frequency of the violence that the community is predisposed to, so they can assess where they are capable in protecting them and the ways and the strategies in which they should develop, whether that means going into the neighborhood and developing a neighborhood watch or putting folks on a most vulnerable list. That also has its own complications because when you put someone on paper, you allow them more likely to be caught up in the system itself negatively. So I think affinity groups, for me personally, I have seen work effectively only when they actually take the criticism from the community. We cannot create affinity groups within an agency and let it be photo optic unless we are holding them accountable from coming into the community, allocating resources to the community, to community centers, security for community centers that deal with LGBTQ direct support services. We need them to invest in specific vulnerable communities within those that they protect and also be willing to take criticism and suggestions from the communities who are predisposed to this violence so that they can know what to adapt within their training. Almost as like its own auditing process of what are you doing and what could you be doing better. That's not going to work for every police agency, but within the police departments I've seen here, I have seen some effective change with the formation of affinity groups and members in the police force who can come forth and use their privilege as an officer, also identifying within the community to help protect those who have less access, so to say.
Thank you so much. I want to end on something of a happy note, maybe. I want to go around and have everyone tell us what gives you hope. There have been some really dark moments, even recently when we hear about the deaths of many trans women of color. What gives you hope for the future of the community, for the future of our country? And I will start with Katie.
The fact that we hear voices. You know, I am always hopeful when we continue to reach out and sometimes shout out. You know, it's not easy, but sometimes it's shouting. But the fact that people are engaged gives me hope. Because when you lose hope, you just walk away. You just say, forget it. I can't do this. And people aren't saying, forget it, I can't do this. They're saying, no, 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 bring me to the table. Bring me to the discussion. You need to hear me. And so I think that has always given me hope, because as long as we're talking, there's room. I also am always amazed in the years that I've worked with crime survivors. I am amazed at the resilience of people. And that is always a hopeful note for me, is people rise always, and especially rise well when we support them. And so that really gives me hope. And the fact that you look across, the signs are creative, the demonstrations are creative. We are a creative people. And that is a hopeful sign. So that's kind of, on the darkest days, that's really what I, see as markers, as kind of lighthouses out there in the darkness, kind of calling us forward.
Thank you. Arcelia?
Thanks, Jonathan. And yes, building on what Katie said, what gives me hope is that we are all starting to awaken to the potential of working together for the change we want to see. And I want to really remind us that none of us are free until all of us are free, right? And the fact that a lot of our movement now for change is intersectional, truly intersectional, becoming more intersectional in its perspective. And what I mean by that is, of course, the Black Lives Movement has its roots in LGBTQIA rights and LGBTQIA violence against our community, right? And the fact that that we're starting to see the connections between all of the violence that's been inflicted on our communities, whether it's immigrant communities, the LGBTQIA community. We can't forget that people in immigration detention, there's many people that come from other countries because of their identities as LGBTQIA. So when we talk about immigration reform, when we talk about freeing people from oppressive detention conditions and immigration, we're talking about people in the LGBTQIA community as well. When we march for Black Lives Matter, we're talking about the transgender women and men that are victimized by police. So the fact that all of these connections are really coming to the fore in our current movement, I think to me is inspiring and gives me hope for what we can do in the future together.
Vanity?
Thanks, Katie and Arcelia, for some things to be hopeful for. I think one of the things that I am most hopeful about is the fact that I'm only 26 and I'm experiencing the strides that I'm experiencing right now. And so I am thankful knowing that and positive that I will live a full, fulfilling life where I will see many more strides as it pertains to our protections and our liberties expand and be more clearly defined. I am hopeful that there will be many other transgender women, specifically those of color, who will be able to become equipped with the language that one learns and matriculates with through college and through higher learning academic institutions. I am confident that the more language and representation we have on film will render us a positive good for our community. And I am hopeful that the more representations, and not just those of folks who are considered passable trans people, will allow folks to have the conversations and the language that they need to shift the paradigm to not only raise trans and GNC youth, but also support those that they see within their community so that we can help them self-actualize a better quality of life where violence isn't a part of.
Thank you all so much for sharing so much of yourselves with us. I think this has been a really powerful conversation that gives me hope about what we can do as a broad coalition to really obtain justice for all of our members of all of our communities in the future, regardless of our identities. And so with that, I would like to bring back the IIP Creative Associate, Shauna K. Salmon, who will close us out with a reading. Thank you all so much, everyone.
Thank you guys so much for such a great and inspiring and insightful conversation. I think that given the movement, not the moment that we are in, I think this section from Sister Outsider, Essays and Speeches by R.J. Lord is perfect for this moment. So she says, "We can learn to work and speak when we are afraid in the same way we have learned to work and speak when we are tired. For we have been socialized to respect fear more than our own needs for language and definition. And while we wait in silence for that final luxury of fearlessness, the weight of that silence will choke us. The fact that we are here and that I speak these words is an attempt to break that silence and to bridge some of those differences between us. For it is not difference which immobilizes us, but silence. And there are so many silences to be broken." Thank you guys so much.